This is Weekly Woman by Jubilance for PMS.
Welcome, Ames. We're so excited to have you today on the podcast. Where are you calling in from?
I'm calling in from Eden Prairie, Minnesota. So I don't know where you're calling from.
Yeah, I'm from New York City, actually. So a little bit further away.
Yes, east of here.
Yeah, but I saw that you actually did. So you were you started off in working in philanthropy for the Minnesota Historical Society. Is that right?
Actually, I started before that.
Okay.
My most significant job I've had probably was working as the primary author and associate editor of a reference book, a monumental reference book called Women's History Sources, a guide to archives and manuscript collections in the United States. I was hired to write and edit and proofread and index this 1,100 page book, which is made up of collections of women's history documents, letters, diaries, minutes of women's meetings, women's group meetings, and so on, from the beginning of the country. So it was in the late 1960s when the late 1970s, excuse me, when women's history was a new field. People didn't really know what it was yet, but that really got me hooked on women's history, thinking about it, doing research on women's history, and finally writing about women's history.
Yeah, I was reading about this book, 1,100 pages. That is insane. And to go from like pre-revolution colonial times to the 1970s when it was published, I was reading that it became like a big source book for the field of women's studies. You were Exactly. At the forefront of all of that, which is absolutely incredible.
Yeah, well, me with a lot of other people. We had a really great staff and a bunch of field workers, women's history, ABD students who were working on their dissertations in women's history, who went around the country to get information for this book. And so there were a whole lot of us, and it was a great effort. It was a wonderful undertaking.
Wow, that's amazing. And now you have a new undertaking with your new book that was just published, Lemons in the Garden of Love. Yes. And you had to do extensive research for this particular book. And it is based on your great grand aunt Blanche.
Yes, well, it was inspired by her.
Okay.
So I took great liberties with the actual life of my great grandaunt, but it was inspired by her. She was one of the co-founders of the Birth Control League of Massachusetts in 1916. So I did do a lot of research on her experiences trying to get birth control legalized in Massachusetts. It took 100 years. From the time that the Comstock laws outlawing birth control were finally overturned by the Supreme Court and in Massachusetts. So that was it was quite an effort.
Wow. And how did you go about that research? I know like this is a field that it's kind of a taboo subject that people don't really talk about, of women's health. And I mean, there's a huge debate right now about abortion and Roe v. Wade. How did you go about looking for this history? I know you mentioned even the predictor, which is one of the earliest home pregnancy tests in your book. How did you find these things?
Yes, well, I did do a lot of research. I went to Smith College, has a very impressive archives of material having to do with women's history, the Sophia Smith collection. So there is an Ames collection of material there. So lots of information about Blanche Ames and about the Birth Control League of Massachusetts. So those are primary documents. So, it's original letters and minutes of meetings and so on that I asked the archivist to make me copies of, since I live in Minnesota, not Massachusetts. It
Mhm.
wasn't easy to get there to see what all they had there. So, so I did a lot of the research there. There are other archives. There's one at Radcliffe that I went to, and one at Boston University. And then at the University of Minnesota, at the Minnesota Historical Society, looking for material about the, well, it wasn't the Birth Control League of Minnesota, but the Planned Parenthood, the beginning of Planned Parenthood in Minnesota. So a lot of research in places like that. I also read a lot of even even diaries and novels from the period, from like 1910s, 1920s, to get the right language down for, as I was creating the diary of the character based on Blanche James.
Wow. That's amazing. You did so much research, and that's great that you were able to get all of that information to you in Minnesota. Were you working on this during the pandemic?
I started work on this 40 years ago.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the first draft of this book was done in about 1980, and I tried to get it published, and it just wasn't the right time for it. So I put it away.
Wow.
And then when Donald Trump was elected president, I decided what I could do. What I wanted to do was to bring this story out, to make sure that it really did get published finally. So I reworked it and reworked it and reworked it, and found a publisher, and got Lemons in the Garden of Love created and out into the world at last.
Wonderful. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. This is the time that we need to tell this story, unfortunately.
Yes.
Unfortunately, it's still relevant 40 years on.
I'm afraid it's really timely.
Mhm. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? What did the early years of women's history leading to Roe v. Wade teach us about this present moment that we're living in?
Well, what I learned working on this novel was that it took, well, as I said briefly before, it took 100 years in Massachusetts to legalize birth control. Birth control had been legal in the 19th century until the Comstock laws were passed, which outlawed contraception and material information about contraception. So that was in 1873. It wasn't until 1916 in Massachusetts where the Birth Control League was finally founded. And it was founded because there was a man who was passing out pamphlets about why not to have too many children in Boston, handing them out to women coming out of a candy factory where they were working, and he was arrested. And so it was his defense fund, these people, women who came together to help defend him. That's what started the Birth Control League of Massachusetts in 1916. The organization continued work. They tried to get laws passed in Massachusetts. They had clinics, birth control clinics, that were functioning very wonderfully in the 1930s until they got the police came and closed them down. They tried to get various bills through the legislature. Finally, in the 1950s, when they turned into the Planned Parenthood League of Massachusetts, birth control still wasn't legal in Massachusetts. So women who came to Planned Parenthood in Massachusetts at that time actually would get sent to Rhode Island, to the Planned Parenthood place in Providence, Rhode Island, to get their birth control. And so, as I say, it took 100 years in Massachusetts for women to finally get legal birth control. Today, I think for most women, it's hard to remember what it was like, hard to even know what it was like before birth control was readily available.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've never lived in a world where it hasn't been easily accessible and something to be like praised and fought for.
And
And then
even counted on.
yeah, and even Roe v. Wade. I've never lived in a world without Roe v. Wade, which I think is the most interesting part of how we can go back on something that was so long ago, before so many lifetimes of people who live in this country.
Exactly. I mean, it was 50 years ago that Roe v. Wade was legalized, on the basis of the right to privacy of women to have an abortion. No state could prohibit abortion before the fetus is viable outside the womb, which occurs around 23 weeks of pregnancy. Now, in the 19th century, abortion was legal until quickening, until a mother could feel the baby moving. But until then, they could have legal abortions in the 18th century and the early 19th century.
And so how was that determined? Was that just the mother saying, I feel this? And
Yes.
so, okay,
Exactly.
so they had even more autonomy back then, because they were saying, okay, I feel this or I don't.
Good point. Plus, if you feel it, and you can get somebody else's hand to feel it too, if it happens when, somebody is standing next to you and wondering.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And so you wrote this book, you decided it was the time to publish. Your publisher obviously felt the same. Can you talk a little bit about what you think people can do to read this book and to learn and to fight for women's health?
Yes, I think it's really, I think reading Lemons in the Garden of Love can be really helpful, especially for women who who were born after Roe v. Wade, because those are the women who don't really know what we could lose. This book, I think, really helps people understand the depths and the human costs, really, of the long struggle for reproductive rights, and its centrality to the unfinished fight for gender equality. Women have been trying to gain equal rights ever since the founding of this country, after all.
Mm-hmm.
And women's fight for equality and control over their own bodies is far from over. It's one of the things that's scariest to me about if Roe v. Wade is overturned, it could very well open challenges to other legal rights to privacy, including contraception. I mean, contraception could be made illegal. And
that's insane.
I know. And it's certainly difficult for millions of women in this country to get access to contraception even now, but it could become illegal. The legal rights to privacy are, that's the basis of Roe v. Wade. It's also the basis for contraception, for same-sex marriage, for interracial marriage. I mean, it could be the beginning of a really slippery slope. What would we do without legal birth control? How do we control what's going to happen, what we're going to choose to do with our lives, how our lives are going to unfold?
That's why we had that sexual revolution in the 60s, because we were finally able to get contraception. We were finally able to go to work and to do other things other than just have children, and to know that we didn't have to have them. And so we could do other things, like you're saying.
Or we could put them off while we finish getting our degree or whatever.
Mm-hmm. And have them later, whenever we want.
Exactly.
It's the decisions we're making, like you're saying.
Exactly. Yep.
And can you talk a little bit about the reception of your book with Planned Parenthood? I read that you have the support of Dr. Jennifer Childs Roshak, the CEO of Planned Parenthood in Massachusetts. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it was very fun to engage with her because this story is mostly about the Birth Control League of Massachusetts. And so I was able to get a draft of the novel to her and her staff, and to get her, for her to read it, for her to give me her comments and
Wow.
blurbs for the back of the book. And the same thing in Minnesota, where I know the CEO, Sarah Stace, quite well. And so she too read the book and had, very nice comments to make about it. I ended up giving hundreds of copies of this book to the Planned Parenthood of Minnesota, sorry,
Huh.
as a gift, because I wanted it to get out there. I mean, that's why I'm talking to you. I want this book, Lemons in the Garden of Love, to go really way out there, to reach as many people as I possibly can. I also sent a copy to the CEO of every Planned Parenthood affiliate in the country. There are 50 of those. But unfortunately, with the pandemic, there was no gala last year, Planned Parenthood events where the books could be given out. I would have done that. I would have loved to have done that, but
hopefully this year.
Happen. Yes, exactly. Hopefully this year.
And can you talk a little bit about what you think the future is for reproductive rights? We've touched on it a little bit, but hopefully something good.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's scary. I mean, I think what's really important is that everybody votes in September. I'm sorry, in November, that we vote for pro-choice candidates. Nancy Pelosi said this coming election is just turned into the biggest fight for women's rights in our nation's history. And I think that's true. I don't think she's overstating it. I don't know that all women think that way or are aware of that, but it's critically important that we elect pro-choice candidates.
Thank you. Yeah, we've got to go get out the vote. So everyone listening, go vote in November. Exactly. Come November, midterm elections count.
They sure do. Yeah. Going forward, it's really challenging. The United States has the highest maternal mortality rate of any developed country. And it's because of the disparity in care and outcomes for Black women. I mean, healthcare for women is just under siege.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about there, which is unfortunate. But I didn't know that about one of the biggest developed nations, and we have the highest cases of mortality for mothers.
Yeah, so one of the problems with if abortion is not legal, women who have troublesome pregnancies, could die. A lot more women will die as a result if abortion becomes illegal, or ectopic pregnancies, miscarriages. I mean, they could really be under siege if abortion isn't legal.
Yeah, I think it will definitely affect the women in red states a lot more, because my state of New York or your state of Minnesota will be okay and be able to have abortions probably forever, hopefully, unless something goes very, very wrong.
Right,
but I think, but like you're saying, it's going to affect the women who don't have as much of a voice and who are more conservative and who don't have as great of access to healthcare like we do in Minnesota or New York City, which is just unfortunate.
Yes, I mean, if Roe v. Wade is overturned, half of the states in this country will ban abortion. I mean, they've already got trigger laws all ready to go. And the decision will be made next week or early in the following week. It's very scary.
Yeah. Oh, well, let's all get out and vote. It's the
Yes,
biggest thing we can
exactly.
do. And read
Exactly.
your book,
And
Lemons in the Garden of Love, to learn more about this history.
exactly. And give copies to your daughters or your sisters or your mothers. I mean, this information is really, really important. My great grand aunt, one of the things that she did, she was an artist. And when, one of the bills that they were trying to get passed didn't go, she ended up carving a wooden penis and going out on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston and showing how to use a condom. Because,
Wow.
people didn't know about that early on in the early 20th century. Physicians didn't know what were the, enough about reproduction and how to provide birth control, legal birth control. The Harvard Medical School did not have any information about birth control in what they offered their students until the 1940s.
Wow.
I mean, doctors didn't know how to help.
It was something that was just passed down orally at the time of how this should work, or from mother to daughter. Hey, you can use this, or you can try this thing, but nothing concrete. That's insane.
Exactly. It was oral information from mother to daughter.
Wow. And how can people find your book, and how can they find out more about Lemons in the Garden of Love?
Well, it's available. It's available from independent bookstores. It's available from Amazon. Unfortunately, Barnes and Noble don't carry it because it's a smaller press, and so they just don't have it in their inventory. They should, but they don't. But independent bookstores can order it, no problem. And as I say, Amazon has it. It is available as an ebook as well. So it's either a paperback or an ebook. There's more information about me and my previous two books on my website, which is amessheldon.com. So very simple. I love talking to book clubs. And so on my website, I've got a section of, well, there's all sorts of information about my three books, but there's also a section, about book clubs and questions for book clubs for each of my three books. So that can be helpful too.
Yeah, I did see that when I was checking out your website, and I was like, oh, this is perfect for my book club. So yeah, definitely going to pitch it hard now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alice.
Yes. And then Ames, something that we ask on this podcast to everyone is, what is your definition of womanhood?
Oh my, that's an interesting question. I think women are surprisingly strong and resourceful, can be powerful. Personally, I think a lot of women are concerned about love and how to express it, how to be a part of a community. Personally, I mean, I don't think that, I think women, well, it's horrible because you get into these sort of social stereotypes about, women are against war. Well, I'm against war, but not all women. So it's kind of hard to say what's true of, all women. But I think women can be very sensitive and caring and loving, and I hope we all will be that way as much of the time as we possibly can. But I think we also need to be powerful about our own needs, our families, how to get what we need for ourselves and our families.
I think that's a great thing to tie everything together, is like, how do we get what we need? We vote, we learn about the history, and go forward. Thank you so much, Ames, for being on the podcast today. And it was great to get to talk to you.
Well, thank you, Alice. I really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you so much for having me on your program. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And please, everybody, read Lemons in the Garden of Love. This is information we all need.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much.